I traveled 10 hours believing I would finally hold my newborn grandson. But the moment I stepped into the hospital, my daughter-in-law looked at me like I was a stranger, invading her perfect little world, and said coldly, "I only want my family here," while my son avoided my eyes and whispered, "Don't push it. She never wanted you here." And in that instant, every sacrifice, every night I spent raising him alone after his mother died, crashed against the humiliating truth that I was no longer considered part of my own blood. So I turned around and walked out quietly, carrying a heartbreak so sharp it felt like it might split my chest open. But I said nothing, not then, not when I sat alone on the bus home replaying their words like a cruel echo. And not even when the phone rang 3 days later and the hospital said, "Sir, the delivery bill is short $15,000. We were told you always help the family." And for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me, not anger exactly, but clarity, the kind that appears only after you have been pushed past your limit and stripped of every last piece of dignity they thought they could take, because what they never imagined was that the man they dismissed as poor, quiet, and irrelevant had been rebuilding himself slowly, silently, and now their greed had opened a door they would wish had stayed closed, because this time I would not be the one paying for their comfort. This time they would learn what it means to underestimate the wrong man, and the revenge they set in motion with one cruel sentence was already unfolding long before they realized who they had really pushed away. My name is Raymond Collier. I'm 68 years old, a retired county surveyor who spent 4 decades measuring land and drawing boundaries across rural Ohio. I buried my wife Margaret 3 years ago, raised my only son Jason mostly on my own, and until last week, I believed the hardest days of my life were behind me. The bus had been rolling for nearly 10 hours when I finally saw the city skyline break through the morning haze. I pressed my forehead against the cold window and watched the buildings grow taller, closer, more intimidating with every mile. In my lap sat a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, a baby blanket Margaret had knitted during her final months back when her hands still obeyed her and her eyes still held that stubborn spark of hope. She never got to finish the matching booties. The cancer took her before she could bind off the last row. But the blanket was complete, soft as a whisper, pale yellow with tiny white stars along the border. She had called it Lucas's blanket, even though we did not know then what the baby would be named. She just knew. Margaret always knew things before anyone else did. I had not slept well on the bus. The seats were too narrow, the air too stale, and my mind too crowded with memories I could not put down. I kept thinking about the day Jason called to tell me Vanessa was pregnant. His voice had been cautious, measured as if he were delivering news he was not sure I deserved to hear. I had not been invited to the baby shower. I learned about it from a photograph someone posted online, Vanessa smiling in a room full of pink and blue balloons, surrounded by people I did not recognize. Jason stood at the edge of the frame, looking somewhere off camera. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself the only thing that mattered was the baby, my grandson. The first grandchild Margaret and I had dreamed about during all those quiet evenings on the porch. The bus pulled into the station, and I gathered my things slowly, letting the younger passengers push ahead. My knees ached from sitting so long, and my back protested when I stood, but I didn't mind. I had waited 3 years to hold something that belonged to the future instead of the past. A little pain was nothing compared to that. I took a taxi to the hospital because I didn't trust myself to navigate the city buses. The driver asked if I was visiting someone, and I told him my grandson had just been born. He smiled and said, "Congratulations." And for a moment, I felt like a normal grandfather on a normal day heading toward a normal joy. I wanted to believe that was true. The hospital lobby nearly overwhelmed me. Everywhere I looked, there were families laughing, crying, embracing fathers carrying balloons, mothers clutching flowers, children pressing their faces against the nursery glass. I stood near the entrance for a long moment, clutching the blanket to my chest, feeling the weight of my worn jacket and scuffed shoes. I had not thought to buy new clothes for this trip. Margaret would have reminded me. She would have laid out a clean shirt the night before and told me to polish my shoes. But Margaret was not here, and I had come as I was an old man in old clothes, carrying an old hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different now. I found the maternity ward on the 3rd floor and walked down the corridor with my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I rehearsed what I would say to Jason. I imagined Vanessa softening when she saw the blanket, recognizing the love stitched into every row. I pictured myself holding Lucas for the first time, feeling his tiny fingers wrap around mine, whispering Margaret's name so he would know her somehow, even though they would never meet. The door to room 312 was closed. I stood outside for a moment, steadying my breath, smoothing down my jacket. This was it. This was the moment I had traveled 10 hours, for the moment I had waited 3 years for the moment. Margaret had dreamed about until her last breath. I reached for the door handle. A sharp voice cut through the hallway behind me, cold and unmistakable. "What is he doing here?" I turned slowly, though part of me already knew who had spoken. Vanessa stood at the end of the hallway near the elevator, a paper cup of coffee in her hand. Her eyes fixed on me with the kind of look you might give a stain on an expensive carpet. She was wearing a silk robe over her hospital gown, her hair pulled back in a way that made her face look sharper than I remembered. She didn't look like a woman who had given birth less than 48 hours ago. She looked like a woman preparing for battle. "I asked you a question," she said, walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. "What are you doing here, Raymond?" I held up the blanket still wrapped in its brown paper. "I came to meet my grandson, and to bring him something his grandmother made." Vanessa stopped a few feet away and looked at the package as if I were offering her something rotten. "I don't want anything from that house," she said. "I told Jason to make that clear. He didn't tell me anything. I found out about the birth from a hospital notification. You listed me as emergency contact, remember?" Probably by accident, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That was a form from months ago. I forgot to update it." The door to room 312 opened behind me and Jason stepped into the hallway. He looked thinner than the last time I had seen him, his shoulders hunched forward in a way that reminded me of how he used to stand when he was a teenager caught in a lie. He glanced at me briefly, then looked away, focusing on a spot somewhere past my shoulder. "Dad," he said quietly, "this isn't a good time." "I called you 3 times, I said. You didn't answer. I left messages." Jason shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "We've been busy. The baby, the visitors, everything. You should have waited until we invited you." "Invited me?" I heard the crack in my own voice and hated it. "He's my grandson, Jason, your mother's grandson. I traveled 10 hours to be here." Vanessa moved past me and positioned herself in the doorway beside Jason, her arm brushing against his in a way that seemed more like a signal than a gesture of affection. She examined me from head to toe, taking in my wrinkled jacket, my scuffed shoes, the brown paper package clutched against my chest. "Look at you," she said softly, almost to herself. "A small-town embarrassment. Is this really what you want Lucas to see? Some old man who couldn't even bother to dress properly?" I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, a sound came from inside the room. A thin, high wail that cut through the air and wrapped itself around my heart. Lucas. My grandson was crying, and I was standing 3 feet from the door and I couldn't reach him. Every instinct told me to push past them, to step into that room and hold the child I had come so far to meet. But I looked at Jason's face and saw something that stopped me cold. It was not anger. It was not even embarrassment. It was fear. Deep, familiar fear, the kind I had seen in him once before, years ago when Margaret was dying and he didn't know how to say goodbye. He was afraid of something, but it was not Vanessa. It was something inside himself, something he could not name or control. I stepped back. My hands trembled as I held out the blanket one more time. "I just wanted to give him his grandmother's blanket," I said. "She made it for him, before she died. She called it Lucas's blanket even though we didn't know his name yet. She knew somehow. She always knew." Vanessa did not look at the blanket. She looked at me, her eyes flat and unreadable. "We don't need it," she said. "And we don't need you." She put her hand on Jason's arm and guided him backward into the room. Jason did not resist. He did not even look at me as the door began to close. "Jason," I said, "please." The door shut with a soft click that echoed through the empty hallway. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood grain, listening to Lucas cry on the other side. Then I heard Vanessa's voice, muffled but clear enough to understand. "He'll never hold that baby," she said, and I could hear the smile in her words. "Not while I'm alive." I do not remember walking to the elevator. I do not remember pressing the button or waiting for the doors to open or stepping inside. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the hospital parking lot with the afternoon sun beating down on my shoulders and the blanket still pressed against my chest like a shield that had failed to protect me from anything. The world moved around me in bright, careless colors. A young father walked past carrying a car seat with a sleeping infant inside, his wife beside him, clutching a bouquet of pink roses. Near the entrance, an elderly man lifted a toddler onto his shoulders, while the child shrieked with laughter, and a woman who must have been the grandmother stood nearby wiping tears from her cheeks. Happy tears, the kind that come when your heart is too full to hold everything inside. I watched them embrace 3 generations wrapped together in a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy, and I felt something inside me crack open like old wood splitting in the cold. I found a bench near the bus stop and sat down heavily, my legs suddenly unwilling to carry me any further. The blanket lay in my lap, still wrapped in its brown paper, and I pulled back the covering just enough to touch the yarn. Margaret had used the softest cotton she could find, a pale yellow that reminded her of the nursery we had painted for Jason 40 years ago. She had worked on this blanket during her final month, sitting in her chair by the window, her fingers moving slowly but surely, even when the medication made her hands tremble and her vision blur. Some days she could only manage a few rows before exhaustion pulled her under, but she never stopped. She never gave up. She told me once that every stitch was a prayer, a wish, a piece of her soul woven into something that would outlast her body. The bus arrived and I climbed aboard, finding a seat near the back where no one would bother me. The ride home would take another 10 hours and I had nothing to do but sit with my thoughts and the weight of what had happened. I leaned my head against the window and watched the city shrink behind us, giving way to suburbs, then farmland, then the endless stretch of highway that connected one world to another. Somewhere around hour 3, when the light outside had faded to a dull gray and most of the other passengers had fallen asleep, I unwrapped the blanket fully and spread it across my lap. I ran my fingers over the stitches, feeling the slight variations in tension that told me which rows Margaret had knitted on good days and which ones she had struggled through. Near the bottom corner, my thumb caught on something unexpected, a small raised patch where the yarn was thicker, more textured. I lifted the blanket closer to my face and squinted in the dim overhead light. There were letters there, tiny letters embroidered into the fabric in a thread so close to the yarn's color that I had never noticed them before. I traced them with my fingertip, trying to make out the shapes. The first letter looked like an M. The second might have been a C, Margaret's initials, I thought. She must have signed her work the way she always did, tucking her name into a corner where only someone looking closely would find it. I pressed my thumb against the embroidery and held it there for a moment as if I could feel her presence through the thread. Then I refolded the blanket carefully and tucked it back into its paper wrapping. Some things were too precious to examine under harsh light. The bus pulled into my town well after midnight. The streets were empty, the storefronts dark, the only movement a stray cat darting across the road in front of us. I walked the 6 blocks to my house because there were no taxis at that hour, and I did not want to call anyone for help. The night air was cold against my face, but I barely felt it. I barely felt anything. The house was exactly as I had left it, dark, silent, waiting. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside without turning on the lights. My feet knew the path by memory through the hallway, past the kitchen, into the living room where Margaret's chair still sat by the window. I lowered myself into it slowly, feeling the familiar shape of the cushions, the faint scent of her lavender hand cream that somehow still lingered in the fabric after all these years. Her photograph sat on the side table, the one from our 35th anniversary, where she was laughing at something I'd said, her eyes bright with a joy that seemed impossible now. I picked it up and held it in my hands. "They wouldn't let me see him, Maggie," I said to the empty room, our grandson. He was right there crying on the other side of the door, and I couldn't reach him. The photograph did not answer. The house did not answer. The silence pressed in around me like a physical weight, and I closed my eyes and let it take me. I fell asleep in her chair with the blanket draped across my chest, and Margaret's face the last thing I saw before the darkness came. I dreamed of a time when our family was whole. Jason as a boy running through the backyard. Margaret standing at the kitchen window watching us with that soft smile she saved for quiet moments. In the dream, there was no Vanessa, no locked door, no grandson I could not hold. There was only love, simple and unbroken, the way it used to be before everything fell apart. The phone rang at 6 in the morning, pulling me out of the dream like a hand reaching into deep water. I fumbled for the receiver, my eyes still blurred with sleep. "Hello? Mr. Raymond Collier." The voice was flat professional, utterly without warmth. Yes, this is Raymond. This is the billing department at St. Michael's Hospital. I'm calling to inform you that you're listed as the financial guarantor for maternity services totaling $15,000. When can we expect payment? I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. The billing officer's words echoed in my skull like stones dropping into still water, each one sending ripples of confusion outward until my whole mind felt disturbed and murky. There must be some mistake, I said. I never signed anything. I wasn't even allowed in the room. Sir, I have the guarantor form right here. The woman's voice remained flat, disinterested as if she had made 100 calls like this, and mine was no different from any other. Raymond Arthur Collier, address 1947 Maple Ridge Road, Granville, Ohio, Social Security number ending in 4471. The signature is dated 2 days before the delivery. My hands began to shake. 2 days before the delivery. I had been home in Ohio 2 days before the delivery, sitting in this very chair waiting for a phone call that never came. I had not signed any form. I had not given anyone permission to use my name or my information. And yet there it was, documented and filed, binding me to a debt I had never agreed to carry. I need to see that form, I said. Can you send me a copy? You'll need to request that in person at our billing office. We're open Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. I hung up without saying goodbye. For a long moment, I sat motionless, staring at the wall, feeling something cold and heavy settle into my chest. Vanessa had not simply rejected me at the hospital door. She had not simply kept me from holding my grandson. She had used me, my name, my identity, my credit, without my knowledge or consent. She had turned me into a source of money, even as she told me I was not welcome in her life. I drove back to the city that same morning. The trip took 4 hours, and I spent every mile replaying the conversation with the billing officer, turning her words over in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I could not quite assemble. $15,000. That was more than I had in my savings account. That was 6 months of careful budgeting, years of small sacrifices, the cushion I had built to protect myself in case something went wrong in my old age. And someone had signed it away with a stroke of a pen that was not mine. The hospital's billing office was in a basement-level fluorescent lights, humming overhead plastic chairs lined up against walls, covered in faded posters about payment plans and financial assistance. I approached the front desk and asked to see the guarantor form for Vanessa Collier's maternity stay. The clerk typed something into her computer, printed out a sheet of paper, and slid it across the counter without looking at me. I picked it up and studied the signature at the bottom of the page. At first glance, it looked like my handwriting. The letters were shaped correctly. The spacing was reasonable. The overall impression was close enough that a busy clerk processing dozens of forms each day would never think to question it. But I had spent 40 years as a county surveyor, signing my name to boundary reports, property assessments, legal documents that needed to withstand scrutiny in court. I knew my own hand the way a musician knows their instrument, and this signature was wrong. The pressure was off. Whoever had written this had pressed too lightly on the downstrokes and too heavily on the curves, creating a subtle imbalance that would be invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. The R in Raymond leaned slightly to the left instead of standing straight. The loop in the C of Collier was too narrow, too pinched, as if the writer had been nervous and rushing. This was forgery. Careful forgery, competent forgery, but forgery nonetheless. I asked the clerk for a copy of the form and drove home in a daze. The radio played songs I did not hear. The highway stretched before me in a blur of gray asphalt and white lines. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that I was too exhausted to appreciate. I sat at the kitchen table and dialed Jason's number. He answered on the 4th ring. Dad. His voice was guarded, wary, as if he had been expecting this call and dreading it. I need to ask you something, I said, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did you know that Vanessa put my name on the hospital's guarantor form? Silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Jason. She probably just made a mistake, he said finally. You know how confusing those hospital forms can be. She was stressed, she was in labor, she probably just wrote down the wrong name. She wrote down my social security number, my address. She forged my signature, Jason. This wasn't a mistake. More silence. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, slow and deliberate, the way he used to breathe when he was a teenager trying to decide whether to lie or tell the truth. Look, Dad, I don't know what happened, but maybe you should just pay it. Keep the peace. You know how Vanessa gets when she feels attacked. Do you hear yourself? My voice cracked. She committed fraud, Jason. She stole my identity. And you want me to pay $15,000 to keep the peace. I want you to stop making everything harder than it has to be. His tone shifted harder now, defensive. You always do this. You always push and push until everyone's exhausted. Did you know? I asked again. Before the birth, did you know she was going to use my name? The silence stretched so long I thought he had hung up. Then barely above a whisper, Dad, don't make this worse. The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone, staring at the screen until it went dark. My son had chosen his side. He had looked at the evidence, heard my voice, understood what his wife had done, and he had chosen her anyway. The betrayal settled into my bones like winter cold, the kind that never quite leaves no matter how many blankets you wrap around yourself. Night fell. I did not turn on the lights. I didn't eat dinner. I simply sat in the dark, feeling the house grow cold around me, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. A gentle knock came at the front door. I rose slowly, my joints protesting, and made my way through the shadows. When I opened the door, Eleanor Brooks stood on my porch holding a casserole dish in one hand and a small business card in the other. She was 82 years old, a widow like me, the kind of neighbor who noticed when your newspapers piled up and your lights stayed off too long. Raymond, she said softly, her eyes full of a sadness that told me she already knew something was wrong. Margaret asked me to wait for the right moment. I think it's time. I stepped aside and let Eleanor into the house. She moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had visited many times before, finding her way to the kitchen without needing directions. I followed her and turned on the light above the stove, filling the room with a soft yellow glow that felt almost intrusive after so many hours of shadow. Eleanor set the casserole on the counter and lowered herself into one of the wooden chairs at the table. She looked older than I remembered her, white hair thinner, her hands spotted with age, but her eyes were sharp and clear as she watched me take the seat across from her. I heard about what happened at the hospital, she said. News travels fast in small towns even when people try to keep things quiet. I'm so sorry, Raymond. How did you know? I have a niece who works in medical records at St. Michael's. She called me this afternoon. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. She told me someone had filed a complaint about a forged signature on a guarantor form. Your name. I nodded slowly, too tired to feel surprised that my humiliation had already spread beyond the walls of that basement billing office. It was Vanessa. She signed my name without my permission, used my social security number, and Jason. My voice caught. Jason told me to just pay it and keep the peace. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they glistened with tears. Margaret was afraid of this, she said quietly. She was afraid something like this would happen. What do you mean? We talked every week during her illness, Raymond. Every Wednesday afternoon I would come over while you were at work and we would sit in her room and talk for hours about you, about Jason, about the future she wouldn't be part of. Eleanor paused, choosing her words carefully. And about her worries. What worries? Eleanor hesitated. Her fingers tightened around each other, knuckles whitening. She saw things, Raymond, things she didn't want to burden you with while she was dying. The way Vanessa looked at this house whenever she visited. The questions she asked about property values, about how much land you owned, about whether the mortgage was paid off. Margaret noticed. She always noticed everything. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I thought back to those final months, to the visits Jason and Vanessa had made from the city, to the conversations I had only half heard while I was focused on Margaret's medications and doctor appointments. Vanessa had asked about the house. I remembered now casual questions that had seemed like small talk at the time. How old is this place? Have you ever thought about selling? What's the land worth these days? I had answered without thinking. I had never imagined those questions meant anything. Margaret gave me something before she died, Eleanor continued. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out the business card she had been holding on the porch. 4 years ago, during one of our Wednesday talks, she handed me this and made me promise to keep it safe. She said, "If Raymond ever needs help protecting what's ours, give him this card. He'll know when the time is right." I took the card from her hand. The paper was slightly worn at the edges, softened by years of waiting. The text was simple: Charles Redmond, attorney at law, with a phone number and address in the city. Why didn't she tell me herself? I asked. Why keep this secret? Eleanor's tears spilled over, tracing thin lines down her weathered cheeks. She didn't want to burden you, Raymond. She was dying. She knew how hard you were working to take care of her, how much you were sacrificing to be present for every moment. She wanted your last months together to be peaceful. She didn't want to fill them with suspicions and legal documents and conversations about what might happen after she was gone. I stared at the card emotions crashing against each other inside my chest like waves against a seawall. Part of me was angry. Angry that Margaret had kept secrets. Angry that she had seen danger and chosen to hide it from me instead of letting me protect our family while she was still alive. But another part of me, the part that had loved her for 43 years, understood. She had been trying to give me a gift. She had been trying to let me focus on love instead of fear, on presence instead of preparation. There's one more thing, Eleanor said. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Margaret made me memorize this exactly. She said, "Tell him I knew. I always knew." I don't know what it means, Raymond, but she made me promise to say those words exactly that way when the time came. I knew. I always knew. The words settled into my mind like seeds falling into freshly turned soil. Margaret had known something she could not tell me directly, something she had hidden in a lawyer's hands and a neighbor's memory, and perhaps in places I had not yet discovered. I looked at the card again, then at Eleanor. What else did Margaret know? Eleanor rose from her chair, avoiding my eyes. "Call the lawyer, Raymond. Some answers aren't mine to give." I called the number on the business card the next morning. A receptionist answered and told me Charles Redmond could see me that afternoon if I was willing to make the drive. I said I would be there by 2 o'clock, and I kept my word. The law office was located in a restored Victorian building on a quiet street lined with oak trees. I climbed the front steps and entered a waiting room that smelled of old books and furniture polish, the kind of place where serious matters were discussed in measured tones. A young woman at the front desk smiled and asked me to take a seat. 10 minutes later, she led me down a hallway to a corner office with tall windows and walls lined with legal volumes. Charles Redmond rose from behind his desk to greet me. He was in his early 60s, with silver hair combed back from a weathered face and eyes that seemed to take my measure in a single glance. His handshake was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who did not waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Collier," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "Please sit down. I've been expecting your call for 3 years." I lowered myself into the chair, uncertain how to respond. "You knew I would come. I hoped you wouldn't have to." Charles settled into his own seat and opened a desk drawer, pulling out a manila folder that looked untouched, its edges still crisp and clean. "But your wife was a practical woman. She understood that hope is not a strategy." He set the folder on the desk between us and rested his hands on top of it. "Margaret came to me shortly after she was diagnosed. She said she needed to create something unusual, something that would protect you and your property long after she was gone. I asked her what kind of protection she had in mind, and she told me a story." "What story?" "A story about a daughter-in-law who asked too many questions, about a young woman who seemed more interested in square footage than family dinners, about small comments and careful glances that most people would dismiss as nothing but that Margaret recognized as something else entirely." Charles opened the folder and turned it so I could see the documents inside. "Your wife was a remarkable woman, Mr. Collier. She saw what was coming before anyone else did, and she took steps to make sure you would be protected." I looked down at the papers. Legal language filled the pages, dense and formal, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Living trust, sole trustee, irrevocable provisions, notarized consent required. "What is this?" I asked, though some part of me already understood. "This is a living trust that Margaret established for your house and property. You are the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary while you are alive. The terms are very specific." Charles leaned forward, his voice taking on a careful, deliberate tone. "The house cannot be sold, mortgaged, transferred, or encumbered in any way without your explicit written consent, and that consent must be notarized by a licensed notary public with 2 independent witnesses present." The implications washed over me slowly like cold water seeping through fabric. So even if someone forged my signature, they could not touch this property, Charles finished. A forged signature on a hospital form is one thing, but a forged notarized document with fake witnesses that is a federal crime with serious prison time. No one with any sense would attempt it. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. Margaret had seen the danger. She had recognized what Vanessa was years before I did, and instead of burdening me with her suspicions while she was dying, she had quietly built a legal fortress around our home. She had given me the gift of peaceful final months together while simultaneously preparing for a battle she knew might come after she was gone. "There's more," Charles said. He flipped to another page in the folder. 8 months ago, someone attempted to file a lien against your property. The claim alleged that you owed a substantial debt and that the lien was necessary to secure payment. The application was denied because of the trust structure. No liens can be attached to the property without trustee consent, which means your consent. Who filed it? Charles turned the paper toward me and pointed to a name type near the bottom of the form. The applicant was Marilyn Dawson. The name meant nothing to me. I searched my memory and came up empty. "I don't know anyone by that name." "You might not," Charles said, "but your daughter-in-law does. Marilyn Dawson is Vanessa's mother." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Vanessa's mother. The woman I had met only twice at the wedding and once at a holiday dinner, a polished and smiling presence who had barely spoken to me. She had tried to put a lien on my house 8 months ago, long before Lucas was born, long before the hospital forms and the forged signature. This was not a sudden act of desperation. This was a pattern. Charles closed the folder and folded his hands on top of it. "Mr. Collier, your wife didn't just protect your house. She anticipated that someday someone might try to take it from you. And she left instructions for that possibility, sealed instructions to be opened only if Vanessa Collier ever made a direct attempt to claim your property or your assets." He reached into the drawer again and produced a white envelope yellowed slightly with age, Margaret's handwriting on the front for Raymond when the time comes. "Do you want to know what they say?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to speak. Charles picked up the envelope carefully, as if it contained something fragile, and slid his letter opener along the seal. Inside were several folded pages covered in Margaret's handwriting, along with a small stack of documents that looked like printouts from a computer research she must have done during those long days when I thought she was resting. Charles read the handwritten note first, his eyes moving slowly across the lines. Then he set it down and began spreading the documents across his desk, arranging them in an order that only he understood. When he finally looked up at me, his expression had changed. The professional detachment was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like admiration. "Your wife conducted her own investigation," he said. "Before she died, she gathered information about Marilyn Dawson that I doubt Marilyn herself knows exists." He turned the first document toward me. It was a printout from a company website showing a professional photograph of Marilyn in a business suit, smiling confidently at the camera. The caption identified her as a senior acquisition specialist for a real estate development firm based in the city. "Marilyn Dawson has worked in real estate development for over 20 years, Charles explained. "Her specialty is identifying undervalued properties, particularly those owned by elderly individuals who might be persuaded to sell under the right circumstances." He turned to the next document, a series of property records Margaret had somehow obtained. "Your wife found a pattern. Over the past 15 years, at least 4 elderly relatives of Marilyn's associates have transferred their properties under questionable circumstances. In each case, the transfer happened shortly after a family member married into the household. In each case, the elderly owner signed documents they later claimed not to understand. And in each case, the property was sold within months to developers at a significant profit." The pieces began clicking together in my mind, forming a picture I did not want to see. "Vanessa," I said slowly, "she married Jason because your property sits on 3 acres of land in a county that has been quietly rezoned for commercial development," Charles finished. "Margaret discovered that much before she died. She didn't know all the details, but she knew enough to understand that your house wasn't just a home to these people. It was an investment opportunity." A knock came at the office door and the receptionist ushered Eleanor into the room. She looked nervous but determined as she settled into the chair beside me. Charles had called her earlier, he explained, to verify certain details of Margaret's wishes and to share information that might be relevant. "Eleanor," Charles said gently, "would you tell Mr. Collier what you told me on the phone this morning?" Eleanor twisted her hands in her lap. About 3 weeks ago, I was having lunch at that little cafe on Main Street, the one with the blue awning. I was sitting in a booth near the back, and I didn't notice when Vanessa and her mother came in and sat in the booth behind me. They didn't see me either. The partition between the booths is high, and I was facing the other direction. She paused, gathering herself. They were talking about something they called Phase 2. Marilyn kept mentioning a deadline, saying they needed to move faster. She said something about getting the old man's signature before the announcement. I didn't understand what announcement she meant, but the way she said it made my skin crawl. Did they mention Raymond by name? Charles asked. Not directly, but Marilyn said the target was being difficult, that he hadn't paid the test bill like they expected. She said they might need to apply more pressure, maybe through the son. Eleanor looked at me with sorrow in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Raymond. I should have told you sooner, but I wasn't sure what I had heard. It sounded so incredible, like something from a movie. The test bill. The $15,000 Vanessa had signed my name to. It was never about the money itself. It was about measuring my response, seeing whether I would simply pay to avoid conflict or whether I would push back. When I pushed back, they must have known their original plan would not work. Now, they were moving to Phase 2, whatever that meant. Charles gathered the documents back into the folder and closed it slowly. Mrs. Collier's note says one more thing, he said, his voice careful and measured. She wrote, if Marilyn is involved, check her husband. The first victim was closer than anyone knew. I felt the blood drain from my face. What husband? Marilyn has been single for as long as I've known her. Vanessa told us her father left when she was young. Charles and Eleanor exchanged a glance that made my stomach tighten. That's exactly what your wife wanted you to find out, Charles said. Because according to her research, Marilyn was married once, a man named Gerald Warren. He died 6 years ago. He paused, and he owned a house free and clear until 2 weeks before his death when he signed it over to his wife. Charles spent the next week investigating Gerald Warren. He called in favors from colleagues, searched public records, and pieced together a story that made my blood run cold. Gerald Warren had been a retired school teacher who lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Columbus. He had owned that house free and clear for 30 years, having paid off the mortgage early with careful saving and simple living. He had 2 adult children from his first marriage, both of whom lived out of state and visited rarely. When Gerald married Marilyn Dawson 12 years ago, his children were surprised but supportive. Their father seemed happy, and Marilyn seemed attentive and caring. The trouble began gradually. Gerald's children noticed that their phone calls went unanswered more often. When they did speak to their father, he seemed confused, distracted, not quite himself. Marilyn always had an explanation. He was tired, he was adjusting to retirement, he was having trouble with his hearing. The children accepted these explanations because they wanted to believe them, because the alternative was too painful to consider. 6 years ago, Gerald Warren died of a heart attack. His children flew in for the funeral and discovered that the house they had expected to inherit no longer belonged to their father. 2 weeks before his death, Gerald had signed a quitclaim deed transferring full ownership to Marilyn. When the children questioned this, Marilyn produced documents showing that Gerald had given them their inheritance, early cash payments, made several years prior, that the children had understood as gifts, not advances against an estate. The children had no resources to fight. They had no proof that their father had been manipulated or coerced. The signatures on the documents appeared genuine, and Marilyn had a lawyer who specialized in making inconvenient questions disappear. Within 6 months, Marilyn sold the house to a developer for 3 times what Gerald had paid for it decades earlier. The children received nothing. Charles told me this story in his office on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the rain streaking down the windows like tears. I listened in silence, feeling the weight of each detail settle onto my shoulders. This was not a woman who had made a single mistake. This was a woman who had perfected a system, who had turned family trust into a business model, who had taught her daughter to do the same. Gerald Warren was the first victim we can document, Charles said. But I doubt he was the only one. People like Marilyn don't start with something this bold. They practice on smaller targets, first learning what works and what doesn't. By the time they reached Gerald, and by the time they reached you, they knew exactly what they were doing. I drove home that evening with my mind churning. The house that had felt like a sanctuary now felt like a fortress under siege, surrounded by enemies I was only beginning to understand. I parked in the driveway and sat for a long moment watching the light fade from the sky, wondering what Margaret would tell me to do if she were still here. A car I did not recognize was parked at the curb. As I stepped out of my truck, a man emerged from the driver's seat and walked toward me. He was in his late 50s, well-dressed in a way that suggested success without ostentation, his gray hair neatly trimmed and his posture straight. He moved with the careful confidence of someone who had earned his place in the world through hard work rather than inheritance. "Mr. Collier," he said, extending his hand, "my name is Franklin Rhodes. I was hoping I could speak with you for a few minutes. It's about your wife." I shook his hand cautiously. "How did you know Margaret?" "She saved my life," he said simply, 32 years ago when I was 26 years old and convinced that the world would be better off without me. We went inside and I made coffee while Franklin sat at the kitchen table and told me his story. He had been a young entrepreneur whose first business had failed catastrophically, leaving him bankrupt and drowning in debt. His wife had left him. His friends had abandoned him, and he had spent 3 days standing on bridges and overpasses trying to find the courage to jump. Margaret had found him on the 4th day. She was working as a nurse at the county hospital then, before she got sick, and she had recognized the signs of a man at the end of his rope. She sat with him for hours, talking and listening, and when he finally broke down and told her everything she did, something he never expected, she lent him money enough to pay his most pressing debts and start over. She asked for nothing in return except a promise. "She told me to pay it forward when the time came," Franklin said. "She said that someday someone would need help the way I needed help, and when that day arrived, I should remember what she did for me." He had rebuilt his life. The money Margaret lent him became the foundation for a property management company that now employed over 200 people. He had paid her back within 5 years, but she had refused to accept interest, insisting that the only repayment she wanted was for him to keep his promise. "Charles Redmond is an old friend of mine," Franklin continued. "He told me what's happening with your daughter-in-law with the trust with all of it, and I realized that the time Margaret spoke about has finally come." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "I'm offering you a position at my company, Mr. Collier, not charity, a real job suited to your experience as a surveyor. We need someone to assess properties, verify boundaries, identify issues before they become problems. The pay is fair, the hours are reasonable, and the work is honest." He slid the card across the table. "Your wife saved my life. Let me help you rebuild yours." I looked at the card, then at Franklin, then at the photograph of Margaret that still hung on the kitchen wall. Even from beyond the grave, she was still taking care of me, still finding ways to protect the family she had loved so fiercely. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I'll think about it." Franklin nodded and rose to leave. As he reached the door, he turned back. "She was the best person I ever met, Mr. Collier. The world got darker when she left it, but I think she's still looking out for you, even now." After he drove away, I sat alone in the kitchen holding his business card and wondering how many other seeds Margaret had planted during her life. How many other debts of kindness were waiting to bloom at exactly the right moment. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message from Jason. "Dad, I need to tell you something, but not on the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow?" "Come alone. Don't tell Vanessa." I met Jason the next morning at a diner 30 miles outside of town, a place neither of us had ever been, where no one would recognize our faces or wonder why a father and son were sitting across from each other in a corner booth, looking like strangers forced to share a table. He was already there when I arrived, hunched over a cup of coffee he had not touched. His eyes fixed on the window, as if he were watching for someone who might be following him. He looked terrible. His face was thinner than I remembered, the bones sharper beneath his skin, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. When he saw me approach, something flickered across his expression. Relief maybe, or fear, or some complicated mixture of both. I slid into the seat across from him and waited. Jason opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it, though the liquid inside must have gone cold long ago. 3 times he started to say something, and 3 times he stopped the words dying before they could reach the air. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and wet. "I know what Vanessa's been doing," he said. "I've known for 2 years." The anger came fast and hot, rising through my chest like fire. 2 years. 2 years he had watched his wife manipulate and deceive. 2 years he had let me walk blind into traps she had set. 2 years he had said nothing while she forged my signature and her mother tried to steal my home. Then why? I started, but Jason cut me off. She threatened to take Lucas. His voice cracked. She said if I ever told anyone, if I ever tried to stop her, she would disappear with him. She has money hidden somewhere, accounts I don't have access to. She said she would take our son to another country and I would never see him again. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I can't lose my son, Dad. I can't. He's the only thing in my life that still makes sense. The anger did not disappear, but it shifted, making room for something else, a grief that felt almost as heavy as the day I buried Margaret. My son had been trapped, caught between his love for his child and his knowledge of his wife's crimes. He had chosen silence not out of cruelty or indifference, but out of the same desperate protective instinct that had driven me to work 2 jobs when he was young, that had driven Margaret to build her secret fortress of legal documents and trusted allies. What do you want me to do? I asked quietly. I don't know, Jason admitted. I just needed you to know that I'm not on her side. I never was. I've just been trying to survive. We talked for another hour, circling around plans and possibilities without landing on anything concrete. By the time I drove home, my mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, anger and sorrow, hope and fear, love and disappointment, all tangled together in ways I could not begin to separate. Eleanor was waiting on my porch when I pulled into the driveway. She stood as I approached, her face pale and determined, her hands clasped in front of her like a woman preparing to confess. We need to talk, she said, about everything I haven't told you. I led her inside and we sat in the living room, the same room where Margaret had spent her final months, where her presence still lingered in the fabric of the curtains and the arrangement of the furniture. Eleanor perched on the edge of the couch, her back straight, her eyes meeting mine with a steadiness that told me whatever she was about to say had been weighing on her for a very long time. Margaret didn't just give me a business card, Eleanor began. She gave me a mission, a purpose. She sat me down in this very room 4 years ago, and she told me exactly what she feared might happen after she was gone. She said there were people who would try to take advantage of you, who would see your kindness as weakness and your trust as opportunity, and she asked me to watch over you. Eleanor's voice trembled, but she pressed on. She said, if Raymond ever faces what I fear is coming, guide him to the people who can help. Don't let him fight alone, and don't tell him any of this unless it becomes absolutely necessary, because he deserves to live in peace for as long as peace is possible. I stared at her, unable to speak. All those years of friendly waves across the driveway, of borrowed cups of sugar and small talk about the weather, all of it had been something more. Eleanor had been watching, waiting, preparing for a moment she hoped would never come. Since you came back from the hospital, Eleanor continued, I've been documenting everything, every text message you showed me, every date and time Vanessa came to the neighborhood, every conversation I overheard at the cafe. I have notes, Raymond, detailed notes organized by date with copies stored in 3 different places. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I'm not just a friendly neighbor, I'm your wife's last gift to you. She placed the folder in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, filled with pages of careful handwriting and printed documents and photographs I did not recognize. My fingers trembled as I opened the cover. On the first page, in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting, were words that made my heart stop. If you're reading this, the wolves have come. But remember, I never left you unprotected. Now look in the blanket, Raymond. Really look. I retrieved the blanket from the closet where I had stored it after returning from the hospital. It still smelled faintly of lavender, the scent Margaret had loved, and as I unfolded it on the kitchen table, I felt her presence so strongly that I half expected to hear her voice telling me where to look. Really look, she had written. I had examined this blanket before, had noticed the tiny embroidered letters in the corner that I assumed were her initials. But Margaret's note suggested there was something more. Something I had missed in my grief and exhaustion. I ran my fingers along every inch of the fabric, pressing gently, searching for anything unusual. The yarn was soft, and even the stitches consistent and tight, exactly what I would expect from Margaret's careful hands. I was beginning to wonder if I had misunderstood her instructions when my thumb caught on something near the bottom corner, a slight thickness in the lining that didn't match the rest of the blanket. I turned the corner inside out and examined it more closely. There, hidden between the outer layer and the backing, was a small envelope no larger than a playing card. It had been sewn into the lining with such precision that it was nearly invisible, the stitches blending seamlessly with the surrounding fabric. Margaret must have added it after she finished the blanket itself, tucking away her secret in the last gift she would ever make for her grandchild. My hands trembled as I carefully cut the threads and removed the envelope. Inside were two items: a handwritten note on Margaret's personal stationery and a folded newspaper clipping that had yellowed slightly with age. The note was brief, written in the careful script she had used when her hands were still steady. "Raymond, if you found this, then Eleanor has done her job and Charles has opened the file. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything while I was alive. I didn't want our last months together to be filled with suspicion and fear. But I need you to understand why they want our home so badly. It was never about the house itself. It was always about what the house will become. Read the article, then call Charles. He'll know what to do. I love you. I always will. M." I unfolded the newspaper clipping. It was from a regional business journal dated 4 years ago, the kind of publication I never read and would never have noticed on my own. The headline announced proposed commercial development in our county, a project that would transform agricultural land into shopping centers, office parks, and residential complexes. Margaret had circled a paragraph near the bottom of the article in red ink, a paragraph that mentioned our street by name as part of the proposed development zone. I called Charles immediately. Within an hour, I was sitting in his office again, the newspaper clipping spread on his desk between us. "I've been researching this since you first came to me," Charles said, pulling up documents on his computer. "The county approved the commercial development zone 6 months ago. The official public announcement is scheduled for 3 months from now, but certain people, developers, real estate insiders, local officials have known about it for much longer." He turned the monitor so I could see a map of the development area. My property sat almost exactly at its center, marked with a red dot that seemed to pulse with significance. "Your current property value is approximately $180,000, Charles continued. "That's the assessment based on residential land use. But once the rezoning is announced and development begins, properties in this area will be worth significantly more. Conservative estimates put your land at over $1.2 million within 5 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. $1.2 million. My modest house on its 3 acres of land, the home Margaret and I had bought 40 years ago for less than $50,000, was sitting on a fortune I had never imagined. "Marilyn Dawson works for a development company," Charles said. "She has access to insider information about rezoning decisions long before they become public. She knew about this years ago, probably before she ever encouraged Vanessa to pursue your son." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This was never about the hospital bill. It was never about the $15,000 or even the house itself. It was about timing. If Marilyn and Vanessa could get my property before the public announcement, they could purchase it at current value and sell it after development for nearly 7 times their investment. But if they failed, if I held on to the land until the announcement, I would become wealthy beyond anything they could manipulate or steal. "The deadline Eleanor overheard," I said slowly. "They need to get my signature before the announcement goes public." "Exactly. Once the rezoning is common knowledge, you'll have developers lining up to make offers. You'll have lawyers advising you. You'll have options. Right now they're counting on your ignorance to keep you vulnerable." Charles's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and answered. I watched his expression shift as he listened, surprise first, then something harder, sharper, almost like satisfaction. "I understand," he said. "Send me everything you have." He hung up and looked at me with eyes that had gone cold and focused. "That was a contact at the county courthouse. Vanessa filed paperwork this morning, an emergency petition for guardianship over you. She's claiming you're mentally incompetent, unable to manage your own affairs." He paused and a thin smile crossed his face. "But she made a mistake. The petition references medical evaluations and psychiatric assessments that don't exist. She fabricated documentation to support her claim." I felt the blood drain from my face. "She's trying to have me declared incompetent so she can control my property." "She's trying," Charles agreed. "But she just handed us everything we need to destroy her. Falsifying court documents is a felony. We've got her, Raymond. We've finally got her." I started my job at Franklin's company the following Monday. The office was located in a converted warehouse on the edge of the city, all exposed brick and high ceilings and windows that let in more natural light than I had seen in years. Franklin introduced me to my colleagues, younger men and women, who looked at my weathered face and calloused hands with curiosity rather than dismissal, and showed me to a small office with a desk, a computer, and a window overlooking a courtyard where someone had planted roses. The work suited me better than I had dared to hope. 40 years of surveying had taught me how to read land the way other people read books, how to see the stories hidden in property lines and elevation changes and soil composition. My job was to assess properties the company was considering for acquisition, to identify potential problems before they became expensive mistakes, to provide the kind of careful analysis that could only come from decades of experience. Within 2 weeks, my supervisors were praising my precision. Within a month, my colleagues were seeking my advice on their own assessments. For the first time in years, I felt productive, valued, purposeful. The fog of grief and isolation that had settled over me since Margaret's death began to lift, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. When I deposited my first paycheck, modest but honest, earned through my own labor, I stood at the bank counter and felt a spark of independence I'd forgotten I was capable of feeling. Meanwhile, Vanessa's carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. Charles called me with updates every few days, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man watching justice unfold in slow motion. The guardianship petition had been rejected by the court and flagged for investigation. The judge had noticed the fabricated medical evaluations and psychiatric assessments, had recognized them as documents that did not exist in any hospital or clinic database. Vanessa had been summoned to explain herself, and her explanations had only deepened the court's suspicions. But that was only the beginning. Charles had discovered that Vanessa's spa business, the one she had opened 2 years ago with such fanfare and ambition, had been funded entirely with loans taken out in my name. She had forged my signature on applications, used my social security number to establish credit lines, and accumulated over $40,000 in debt that I had never agreed to carry. When Charles reported this to the authorities, the spa received a cease and desist order for operating without proper licensing. Inspectors arrived to find code violations, safety hazards, and financial records that did not add up. Marilyn's development company, sensing the shifting winds, quietly distanced itself from both mother and daughter. Marilyn herself had stopped returning Vanessa's calls, retreating into a silence that spoke louder than any words. The woman who had orchestrated so many schemes was now protecting herself, cutting ties with her own daughter to avoid being dragged down by the wreckage. I heard all of this with a mixture of grim satisfaction and deep sorrow. Satisfaction because justice was finally being served, because the people who had tried to destroy me were now facing consequences for their actions. But sorrow too, because somewhere in the middle of all this chaos was my son, and somewhere even deeper was my grandson, and I knew that their lives were being torn apart by forces they had never fully understood. The call came on a Thursday evening, just as I was finishing dinner. Jason's name appeared on my phone screen, and when I answered, I heard something I had not heard since he was a child, my son sobbing. "Dad," he choked out, "it's falling apart. Everything. The spa is closed. The bank is calling about loans I didn't know existed. There are lawyers sending letters, creditors demanding payment, people showing up at the house asking questions I can't answer." I listened in silence, letting him pour out the words that had been building inside him for God knows how long. "She blames me," Jason continued, his voice ragged. "She says I should have managed the money better, should have paid more attention, should have stopped you from ruining everything. She blames you too. She blames everyone except herself, and Lucas—" His voice broke completely. "Lucas cries all night because we're always fighting. He's 4 months old and he's already learned that his home is not a safe place. I don't know what to do anymore, Dad. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if it can be fixed." I closed my eyes and let the weight of his pain settle into my chest. This was my son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd loved even when he turned away from me, the father of my only grandchild. He had made terrible choices, had allowed himself to be manipulated and controlled, had stood by while his wife tried to destroy me, but he was still my son, and he was drowning. "Jason," I said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not going to save Vanessa. What she did, the forgery, the fraud, the lies, those are her choices, and she has to face the consequences. I can't protect her from that, and I wouldn't even if I could." I heard him draw a shaky breath, waiting. "But I might be able to save you and Lucas. There are things you don't know, Jason. Things your mother discovered before she died. Things I've learned in the past few weeks. The situation is much bigger than you realize and much more dangerous. If you want to get out of this, if you want to protect your son, you need to understand what you're really dealing with." The line was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice that sounded younger and more fragile than I had heard in decades, my son whispered, "Tell me, Dad. Tell me everything." "Not over the phone, Ate," I said. "Meet me tomorrow, same diner as before, and Jason this time be ready to choose." We met at the same diner the next morning, but this time I was not alone. Charles Redmond sat beside me in the booth, a leather briefcase at his feet containing documents that would shatter whatever illusions Jason still held about his wife. Eleanor had wanted to come too, but I asked her to stay home. Some truths are too heavy to deliver in a crowd. Jason arrived looking worse than before, if that was possible. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes carrying the hollow look of a man who had not slept in days. He slid into the seat across from us and glanced at Charles with a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. "This is Charles Redmond," I said. "He was your mother's attorney. He's been helping me understand what Vanessa and her mother have been doing." Jason nodded slowly but said nothing. He looked like a man bracing for a blow he knew was coming but could not avoid. Charles opened his briefcase and began laying documents on the table between us one by one, each page adding another layer to the portrait of betrayal. The trust Margaret had created to protect our home, the forged signatures on the hospital guarantor forms, the fraudulent guardianship petition with its fabricated medical evaluations, the loan applications for the spa, all bearing my name in handwriting that was close to mine but not quite right. Jason studied each document with the careful attention of a man searching for something to dispute some detail that might prove this was all a misunderstanding. But with each page, his face grew paler, his shoulders more hunched, his breathing more shallow. "I knew she had secrets," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Financial things she didn't want to talk about. I found credit card statements once hidden in a drawer with charges I didn't recognize. When I asked about them, she got angry and told me I was being controlling, so I stopped asking." He looked up at me with eyes full of shame. "I thought if I ignored it long enough it would go away. I thought she would change." "There's more," Charles said gently. "And this is the part that's going to be hardest to hear." He pulled out a final folder thinner than the others, but somehow more ominous. Inside were death certificates, property records, and a photograph of an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Gerald Warren," Charles began. "He was a retired schoolteacher who married Marilyn Dawson 12 years ago. He owned a house free and clear, no mortgage, no debt. He had 2 adult children from his first marriage who expected to inherit that house when he died." Jason stared at the photograph. "I've seen this man before. There's a picture of him in Marilyn's house. Vanessa told me he was her stepfather, that he died when she was in college." "That's partially true," Charles said. "Gerald Warren was indeed Vanessa's stepfather, and he did die 6 years ago of a heart attack. But what Vanessa didn't tell you is that he died while she and her mother were pressuring him to sign over his property. His children later told investigators that Gerald had been under enormous stress in his final months, that Marilyn had been pushing him to change his will, that Vanessa had visited frequently and always left him agitated and upset." Jason's face had gone completely white. "Are you saying they killed him?" "I'm saying the stress contributed to his death. I'm saying that 2 weeks before his heart attack, Gerald signed a quitclaim deed transferring his house to Marilyn. I'm saying that his biological children tried to contest the transfer, but lacked the resources to fight Marilyn's lawyers." Charles paused. "And I'm saying that this is not the first time Vanessa and her mother have done this. Your father isn't their first victim, Jason. He's their latest target. They have a pattern: identify elderly relatives with valuable property, apply pressure until they sign it over, and then move on to the next mark." The silence that followed was absolute. Jason sat motionless, staring at the photograph of Gerald Warren, his mind clearly working through years of memories and moments that were suddenly reframing themselves in a terrible new light. "She used me," he said finally. "The whole marriage, it was never about love. It was about getting access to my father's property." "Yes," I said quietly. There was no point in softening it. "And Lucas," Jason's voice cracked. "Was Lucas part of the plan too?" Charles and I exchanged a glance. This was the cruelest truth of all. and we had debated whether to speak it aloud. "Lucas gave Vanessa control over you," Charles said carefully. "As long as she had your son, she knew you would stay compliant. You said it yourself, she threatened to disappear with him if you ever tried to stop her. That's not the behavior of a loving mother. That's the behavior of someone who sees a child as leverage." Jason made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, the sound of a man whose entire world had just collapsed into rubble at his feet. He buried his face in his hands and sat there for a long moment, shoulders shaking while I watched and felt my heart break for him all over again. When he finally looked up, something had changed in his expression. The defeat was still there, but beneath it was something harder, sharper, a resolve I had not seen in him since he was a teenager standing up to a bully at school. "Dad," he said slowly, "I need to tell you what Vanessa said last night. After you and I talked on the phone, she must have sensed something was wrong. She started making calls, packing bags, moving money around on her laptop. And when I asked what she was doing, she laughed and said it didn't matter because we wouldn't be here much longer." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "She's planning to take Lucas and leave the country. She has plane tickets for next week. I saw the confirmation email on her phone when she wasn't looking. 3 tickets, her, Lucas, and her mother." Jason's jaw tightened. "She's going to run, Dad. She's going to take my son and disappear. We have to stop her." We drove directly from the diner to Charles's office. Jason sat in the passenger seat of my truck, clutching his phone like a lifeline, scrolling through emails and text messages he had saved over the past 2 years. Digital evidence of conversations he had tried to forget, instructions he had followed without questioning, secrets he had kept, because keeping them seemed easier than confronting the truth. Charles was waiting for us when we arrived. He had cleared his afternoon schedule after I called him from the diner parking lot, and his receptionist ushered us straight into his office without the usual pleasantries. The gravity of what we were about to do hung in the air like smoke impossible to ignore. Jason laid everything on Charles's desk, bank statements showing transfers he had not authorized, emails Vanessa had asked him to forward containing financial information about my accounts that she should never have possessed, text messages documenting her instructions: pay this bill, sign this form, don't ask questions, don't tell your father. Each piece of evidence was another brick in the wall we were building, another nail in the coffin of the life Jason had thought he was living. "I need you to understand what this means," Charles said, looking at Jason with the serious expression of a man who had guided many clients through difficult decisions. "If you sign a witness statement, you're committing yourself to testifying against your wife in court. You're providing evidence that will be used to prosecute her for multiple felonies. There's no taking it back once you start down this road." Jason nodded slowly. His hands were trembling as he picked up the pen Charles offered him, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I know what I'm doing. I should have done it years ago." He signed the statement with careful, deliberate strokes, his name, the date, his acknowledgement that everything he had provided was true to the best of his knowledge. When he set down the pen, I saw something shift in his posture, as if the weight of years of silence was finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. Charles moved quickly after that. Within 48 hours, he had filed a comprehensive complaint with the county prosecutor's office: forgery, identity theft, fraud, and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He included Eleanor's documented observations, the fabricated guardianship petition, the loan applications bearing my forged signature, and Jason's witness statement detailing Vanessa's instructions and deceptions. The police opened a formal investigation the same day. Vanessa's bank accounts were frozen, pending inquiry. Her credit card suspended, her access to the financial infrastructure she had built on lies and stolen identities suddenly and completely cut off. I imagined her discovering this, trying to make a purchase, and having her card declined, logging into her accounts and finding them locked, realizing that the walls were closing in from every direction. Marilyn sensed the shift before anyone told her directly. Mothers and daughters share a kind of invisible communication, and Marilyn had survived too long in her particular line of work to miss the signs of an operation going bad. She stopped returning Vanessa's calls. She stopped answering her door when Vanessa drove to her house. Within a week, Charles learned through his courthouse contacts that Marilyn had quietly hired her own attorney, a criminal defense specialist known for negotiating favorable plea deals. She was preparing to save herself even if it meant abandoning her daughter. I watched all of this unfold with a complicated mixture of emotions I could not fully name. Satisfaction, certainly the satisfaction of seeing justice finally begin to move against the people who had tried to destroy me. But also sorrow, because every step forward in this legal battle was also a step deeper into the wreckage of my family. Vanessa was my son's wife. She was the mother of my grandchild. Whatever she had done, whatever she deserved, her downfall would leave scars that might never fully heal. Jason came to my house the evening after he signed his statement. He stood on the porch where Eleanor had stood weeks earlier, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his eyes red from crying or sleeplessness or both. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside and let him enter. We sat in the living room, the same room where Margaret had spent her final months, where I had read her note about the wolves and the blanket, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. "I was a coward, Dad," Jason finally said. His voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. "I watched her treat you like garbage. I heard the things she said, saw the things she did, and I told myself it wasn't my business, that staying quiet was the same as keeping the peace. But it wasn't peace. It was just cowardice, dressed up in nicer clothes." He looked at me with eyes that held more pain than I had ever seen in them before. "I'll never forgive myself for that, for what I let happen to you, for what I almost let her take from you." I thought about all the things I could say, the accusations I could make, the wounds I could reopen, the years of hurt I could lay at his feet and demand he carry. But looking at my son, broken and remorseful and finally ready to face the truth, I found that the anger I had been carrying had transformed into something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever completely, but something softer, something that felt like the first green shoot pushing through soil after a long winter. "Let's start with saving Lucas," I said quietly. Jason nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back. The police arrived at Vanessa's door at 6 in the morning 3 days later. I was not there to see it. Charles had advised me to stay away to let the law do its work without any appearance of personal involvement, but Jason told me everything afterward. She had opened the door in her robe, expecting Jason, who had moved out and been staying with me since signing his statement. When she saw the uniformed officers standing on her porch, warrant in hand, her face went through a rapid series of transformations: confusion, then fear, then a rage so pure and incandescent that Jason said it barely looked human. She screamed one name as they led her away in handcuffs, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, loud enough to echo down the quiet suburban street in the gray morning light. Raymond. The arrest made the local news that evening. A well-dressed woman in handcuffs, her face contorted with rage, being escorted from a suburban home while neighbors watched from their porches. The anchor described the charges: multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, forgery, and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult, in the detached tone reserved for stories about strangers whose misfortunes make for compelling television. During questioning at the police station, Vanessa maintained her innocence with the desperate conviction of someone who had spent so long believing her own lies that she could no longer distinguish them from truth. She insisted that Raymond had coerced Jason into making false statements. She claimed she was the real victim, a loving wife and mother whose family had turned against her for reasons she could not understand. She demanded to speak with her attorney, demanded to be released, demanded that someone recognize the terrible injustice being done to her. But the evidence was overwhelming. Charles had built a case so comprehensive that even the most sympathetic jury would struggle to find reasonable doubt. The forged signatures on hospital forms and loan applications, the fabricated guardianship petition with its non-existent medical evaluations, Jason's detailed witness statement documenting years of manipulation and deception, and perhaps most damning of all, surveillance footage from Eleanor's security camera installed months ago at Charles's suggestion, showing Vanessa going through my mailbox on 3 separate occasions, removing documents she had no right to take. Marilyn saw the writing on the wall before anyone else. She had spent decades navigating the edges of legality, and she knew when a situation had become unsalvageable. 2 days after Vanessa's arrest, Marilyn walked into the prosecutor's office with her own attorney and offered to cooperate fully in exchange for reduced charges. She provided everything: bank records, emails, text messages, a detailed account of every scheme she and Vanessa had executed over the past decade. She described Gerald Warren's final months with clinical detachment, explained how they had pressured him to sign over his property, admitted that his death had been an unexpected complication that ultimately worked in their favor. And when the prosecutor asked about her daughter's role in all of this, Marilyn did not hesitate. "Vanessa manipulated me," she said, according to the transcript Charles later obtained. "She's always been the one pushing for more, always wanting bigger targets, higher stakes. I was just trying to help my daughter. I never realized how far she would go." The betrayal was complete. The woman who had taught Vanessa everything she knew about exploitation and deception was now painting her own daughter as the mastermind, sacrificing her to save herself. I wondered if Vanessa had seen it coming, if she had recognized the same cold calculation in her mother that she had learned to use against others. Probably not. Predators never expect to become prey. The bail hearing took place on a Thursday morning in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and anxiety. I sat in the back row with Jason watching as the prosecutor laid out the extent of Vanessa's financial destruction: over $140,000 in fraudulent loans. Unpaid vendors and credit card balances accumulated across dozens of accounts opened in my name and others. The numbers filled the courtroom like a physical presence. Each figure, another weight pressing down on the woman standing before the judge. When the prosecutor mentioned the plane tickets, 3 one-way fares to a country with no extradition treaty purchased 2 weeks before the arrest, the judge's expression hardened. "Flight risk," she said, and denied bail without hesitation. Vanessa turned to look at the gallery as the bailiff moved to escort her back to holding. Her eyes found Jason immediately searching his face for something: support maybe, or sympathy, or the obedience she had trained into him over years of manipulation. But Jason did not meet her gaze. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his hands folded in his lap, refusing to give her even that small acknowledgement. She was still staring at him when they led her away. That night, Jason came to my house carrying something more precious than any document or evidence or legal victory. He stood on my porch in the soft glow of the evening light, and in his arms was a small bundle wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. Margaret's blanket, the one she had knitted with trembling hands during her final months. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'd like you to meet your grandson." I took Lucas into my arms for the first time 3 months after his birth and felt the weight of him settle against my chest like an answer to a prayer I had not known I was still praying. He was so small, so perfect, his tiny fingers curling and uncurling as he slept. When I touched his hand, he grabbed my finger and held tight, instinctively trusting. Tears streamed down my face as I looked at Margaret's photograph on the wall. "I promised your grandmother I'd protect this family," I whispered to the sleeping child in my arms. "I kept my word, little one. I kept my word." Jason moved into my house the following week, bringing Lucas and 2 suitcases containing everything he could not bear to leave behind. The spare bedroom that had sat empty since Margaret's death became a nursery almost overnight, a crib borrowed from Eleanor, a changing table purchased second-hand stuffed animals and baby clothes, appearing as if by magic from neighbors and co-workers who had heard fragments of our story and wanted to help. The first days were awkward in ways I had not anticipated. Years of distance do not disappear simply because circumstances force 2 people under the same roof. Jason and I moved around each other carefully, politely, like strangers sharing a hotel room, uncertain of boundaries and uncomfortable with silence. He apologized too often. I reassured too quickly. Neither of us knew quite how to be father and son again after so long pretending we were something less, but Lucas, in his innocent and demanding way, refused to let us remain strangers. He needed feeding at 2 in the morning, and again at 5 needed changing and holding and comforting at hours when pride and awkwardness seemed like luxuries neither of us could afford. Jason and I developed a rhythm without discussing it. He took the midnight shift. I took the early morning, and somewhere in between, we passed the baby back and forth with the wordless coordination of people who had finally found a shared purpose. Afternoons, we walked together, pushing Lucas in a stroller Eleanor had found at a church rummage sale, following the quiet streets of the neighborhood I had lived in for 40 years. We talked about small things at first: the weather, the changing leaves, the progress of construction projects I had assessed for Franklin's company. We didn't talk about Vanessa. We didn't talk about the trial that was slowly working its way through the court system. Some wounds need time before they can be touched. But one evening, after Lucas had fallen asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Jason found me sitting in Margaret's chair and lowered himself onto the couch across from me. His face was pale in the lamplight, his eyes carrying a weight I recognized from my own reflection in the months after Margaret died. "I knew she was wrong, Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. From the hospital. From the moment she shut that door in your face, I knew, but I couldn't. He pressed his hands against his eyes. I didn't have the courage. I told myself it would get better, that she would change, that staying quiet was the same as keeping Lucas safe. But it wasn't. It was just fear dressed up as love. I listened without interrupting, letting him speak the words he had carried for so long. When he finished, I did not offer comfort or absolution. Instead, I told him about my own failures, the years I had worked too much. The school events I had missed, the signs of his struggling marriage I'd chosen not to see, because seeing them would have required me to act. We both made mistakes, I said. You made yours out of fear. I made mine out of blindness. The question now is not who failed worse. The question is what we do next. Jason looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Something passed between us in that silence. Not forgiveness exactly, but something close to it. An acknowledgement that we were both imperfect, both wounded, both trying to find our way back to something that resembled wholeness. Spring arrived, and with it came changes I had not dared to hope for. Franklin called me into his office one morning and offered me a promotion, regional assessor, a position with real responsibility and a salary that would allow me to stop worrying about every unexpected expense. I accepted with a gratitude I could barely express. Shaking his hand and remembering the young man Margaret had saved 30 years ago, the debt of kindness that had finally come full circle. Eleanor insisted on throwing a dinner party to celebrate. She spent 2 days cooking, filling my kitchen with aromas I had not smelled since Margaret was alive. Roast chicken, fresh bread, apple pie cooling on the counter. Franklin came with a bottle of wine. Charles brought flowers. Jason carried Lucas downstairs in his arms, and the baby gurgled and cooed at the attention, utterly unaware of the storms his small life had already weathered. I looked around the table at these people who had become my family, not through blood, but through choice. Through loyalty and kindness and the stubborn refusal to let me face my troubles alone. Margaret had planted seeds I was only now beginning to see bloom, connections she had nurtured knowing they might someday save me. After dinner, as the others cleared dishes and argued cheerfully about whose pie recipe was superior, Eleanor pulled me aside. She pressed a small package into my hands wrapped in brown paper and tied with a ribbon that had faded with age. "Margaret gave this to me with the business card," she said softly. "She told me to give it to you only when you were truly happy again. I think that time has finally come." I unwrapped the package slowly, my heart pounding. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed in Margaret's handwriting to a name that made my breath catch. Lucas. I stood in the kitchen holding the envelope long after the others had gone home. Jason had taken Lucas upstairs to bed, and Eleanor had hugged me goodbye with tears in her eyes, as if she understood the weight of what she had just delivered. The house settled into silence around me, the familiar creaks and sighs of old wood and older memories, and I traced my finger over Margaret's handwriting, the graceful loops of the L, the careful curve of the S, feeling her presence so strongly that I half expected to hear her voice. My hands trembled as I opened the seal. The paper inside was folded twice, slightly yellowed at the edges, dated 4 years ago. In the corner, the month Margaret first learned that the illness would take her. She had written this letter knowing she would never meet the grandchild. It was addressed to knowing she was planting a seed she would never see bloom. To my future grandchild, the letter began in handwriting that was still steady, still sure, not yet weakened by the months of treatment that would follow. "I don't know your name. I don't know if you'll be a boy or a girl, whether you'll have your father's eyes or your grandfather's stubborn chin. I don't know what the world will look like when you're old enough to read this, or what challenges you'll face, or what dreams will fill your heart. But I know one thing with absolute certainty: you will be loved. You will be loved fiercely, completely, unconditionally by a grandfather who has more courage and kindness in his little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. Your grandfather is the strongest man I know, not because he never falls, but because he always gets back up. Life has knocked him down more times than I can count, and every single time he has risen. He raised your father with patience and sacrifice. He cared for me through my illness without complaint. And if you're reading this letter, it means he faced whatever darkness came after I was gone and found his way back to the light." I stopped reading, my vision blurred with tears. Jason had come downstairs without me hearing, and he stood in the doorway watching me, his own eyes glistening. "Read it out loud," he said quietly. "Please." I nodded and continued, my voice breaking on every other word. "I don't know what kind of family you'll grow up in, little one. I hope it's filled with laughter and warmth and Sunday dinners that last until the stars come out. But even if it's not, even if there are hard times and broken promises and people who let you down, remember this. Real family isn't about blood or names. It's about the people who choose you and keep choosing you even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when walking away would be easier. Your grandfather chose you before you were born. He chose to love you before he knew your name or held you in his arms. That's the kind of love that lasts forever, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances or convenience, but on a decision made in the deepest part of the heart and renewed every single day. Be kind, little one. Be brave. And when life knocks you down, because it will, I promise you, it will remember that getting back up is not a sign of stubbornness. It's a sign of strength. Your grandfather taught me that. And now through this letter, I'm teaching it to you. I love you. I always will. Even if we never meet, even if I'm nothing but stories and photographs by the time you read this, know that you were loved before you existed. And that love will never, ever fade. With all my heart. Grandma Margaret. Jason crossed the room and knelt beside me, tears streaming down his face. I handed him the letter, and he read it again in silence, his lips moving slightly over the words. "She knew, didn't she?" he whispered. "About everything. About Vanessa, about the house, about all of it." I nodded slowly. She always knew. She just gave us room to find our own way back to each other. We sat together until the sky outside the window turned from black to gray to the soft pink of dawn. Lucas woke crying, and Jason brought him downstairs, and I held my grandson in my arms while the sun rose over the house. Margaret had loved the house. She had protected the house that would now pass to the next generation. A week later, the development company made its public announcement. My property, the modest 3 acres I had tended for 40 years, was suddenly worth $1.3 million. Developers called with offers. Investors sent letters. The whole town seemed to vibrate with the news. I did not sell. I called Charles and told him to establish a trust in Lucas's name to protect this land for my grandson, the same way Margaret had protected it for me. "My wife built this foundation," I said. "I'm just adding another floor." That evening I stood on the porch with Lucas in my arms and Jason beside me. Eleanor waved from her garden next door. Franklin honked as he drove past on his way home from work. The house stood solid behind us, filled with warmth and memory and the echoes of a love that death could not diminish. I thought about Vanessa in her cell awaiting trial. I thought about Marilyn alone with her regrets, and I felt something I had not expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but peace. A deep, quiet peace that settled into my bones like sunlight after a long winter. They called me a small-town nobody, a burden, a fool. They never imagined what I would become or what Margaret had made sure I would always have a home, a family, and the strength to protect them both. My name is Raymond Collier, and I kept my promise. And that was Raymond's story. A story about betrayal and resilience, about the quiet strength of a man who refused to let cruelty define his final chapters. When Vanessa shut that hospital door in his face, she thought she was dealing with a small-town nobody, an old man too weak to fight back. She never imagined that Margaret had spent her dying days building an invisible fortress around the husband she loved, planting seeds of protection that would bloom at exactly the right moment. Raymond did not win through revenge or anger. He won through patience, through the loyalty of friends who chose to stand beside him, and through a love that reached beyond the grave to shield him from harm. His story reminds us that real family is not always the people who share our blood. Sometimes it is the neighbor who keeps a promise for 4 years, the stranger who repays a kindness from decades ago, or the son who finally finds the courage to choose what is right over what is easy. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted? How did you find the strength to rise again? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let others know they are not alone. If you believe in the power of quiet strength and second chances, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us why resilience and love will always triumph over greed and deception. Thank you for watching until the end. Your support means everything.